realize this, but did you know you're probably leading by example every day? You're probably leading even when you're not in charge. So we're going to kind of talk about what you do when you're here. So what makes this kind of interesting, right, is that there's actually a formal organization and then there's the shadow org chart, and you're probably in both of them. So you probably have a formal position in the organization chart regardless of where it is. But then there's a shadow org chart, and this is more heavily weighted towards the bottom. And that shadow org chart are your friends and your resources and your peer groups and other people that you interact with across the entire organization. That actually is more powerful than the formal org chart. The org chart just tells you who is supposedly in charge of something, but in reality, it's those working groups and those working relationships among workers, among people who are further down the food chain, that actually make the organization work. So it's really kind of interesting because this is your opportunity to lead. If you're like me, you're more comfortable at a lower end of the food chain. Like, again, I like to teach. That's where I'm at. That's where I'm good. And that's where my opportunity to lead comes in, helping students get to where they want to go. Now, as for my manager and all the rest of it, that's another thing. But all the instructors tend to get together, and we're going to participate in some cases, kind of lead informal ideas as they perk up the food chain. We'll say, hey, this would be really kind of cool. Maybe this kind of technology or something else. So these are opportunities to lead when you're not in charge. And these can be really useful skills to have and really interesting when you start exercising that opportunity to lead from below, because it's all based on the personal relationships that you can make with people that are in similar or same situation you're in. So if you all have a really crazy manager that no one really likes, this is your opportunity to lead. And there's some steps that you can do here because there's really 5 steps to being this informal leader when you're not in charge. And that is, one, make sure your peers are empowered. And this can be through venting, this can be through support, this can be through knowing where to go, right? The more you know about the organization, the more you can direct people in the right direction. And that can empower people, especially if they're new and they don't know the organization well. The other thing that's kind of interesting too is become the idea person. Now, this doesn't just apply to work, but this comes up to solutions for what other people are going through. And one of the first questions you need to ask yourself before you become an idea person is the person that's coming to you looking for venting or looking for solution? And we have a whole section on that. Or do you have something that would actually make the company more efficient? And if you are you going to take that idea to your boss? What kind of trust do you have in your boss with something that could be rewarded by the organization? Do you think your boss is going to not take credit for it? Do you think your boss would be honest when giving it to the person up the chain? So maybe that idea person needs to go through a suggestion box, right? Or some other process. The other one that's really kind of cool is never say no to training. This works really, really well for me in the military. I said, hey, we need someone to go to this training. I said, yes. And it ended up that I went to school like every 9 months while I was in the Navy and learned all sorts of crazy things that were lots of fun to do, and found myself in many crazy experiments and many crazy things happening along the way on board ships, submarines, and airframes. So you never miss those growth opportunities. If someone says, hey, I need someone to go do this training on this machine, say yes. Always say yes, never say no, because that just builds your skill list. That just builds you and makes you more marketable, right? Not just survivable in the company. We're beyond that, but more marketable because other people may use those systems as well. One of my first jobs, I learned how to run one of the big photo processing machines. And I learned to do that when I was in a different state. And I moved back home. I've noticed that there was a photo lab just down the street from where my parents were living because I had moved back home. And I walked in the door. I said, hey, I know how to run one of these machines. Do you have a job opening? And sure enough, boom, was done. And that was my growth opportunity, was learning how to run that big honkin' Noritsu photographic machine, right? The other thing that's kind of interesting too is keep a transparent and courageous attitude, right? And this one's really can be kind of hard because when you're kind of working through things, you may have a bad manager, and that bad manager may be grinding you down. And you may still want to do things, and you still may see a way of moving around or otherwise not involving that horrible manager. And sometimes it takes courage, right? Again, you don't want to go over your manager's head. That's generally a bad thing. But sometimes you have to, right? It's just that simple. Sometimes you have to. Right? And then make your actions deliberate. Really think about what you're going to do. And we'll talk about think, act, do here in the next lecture on this one. But make your actions deliberate can kind of help set up that framework for where you're going to go and where you're going to go from next. Now, what I mean by empowered, right? Leadership is really about community. If you can build a community, you are a community leader. And that's that simple. You can help others, or you can provide support, direction, encouragement to team members all the time. You're going to do this naturally as that community leader. Now, that's different because you're peer group than your manager. And sometimes that peer group leader, that community leader, is actually more important than the manager is. Right. So when others are making decisions, like maybe they need to do a thing, go ahead and support them. Right. If they've got a kid who's going to go do a play or something else, they need some time off, man, support them. Help your peers accomplish a goal. Maybe they have a personal goal in the organization. They want some kind of training. Help them get that training. Right. They will never, ever, ever forget that you helped them. And that's some really good karma coming back to you. Now, feedback as simple as, oh, wow, what a great job, everybody, high five today, right? From a peer sometimes goes further than that coffee cart or that pizza party, right, that a manager will go to. It will just go a lot further than what you've got. The other thing that's kind of cool, though, is the idea person. So this can be a little odds at times, right? Because you've got to weigh a bunch of stuff. You might see a way to do your job better. You may want to provide that idea to your company or to your boss. And that's a whole different subject, right? Because you're going to start running into people, politics, and culture on that way, right? And again, don't be surprised if your boss is weak or your boss is a bad leader, as they'll take credit for your ideas, especially if there's a bonus or especially if there's some kind of reward for that, right? But ideas don't need to be revolutionary, all right? They don't need to change the whole company. They don't need to be life-changing. They don't need to be altering in any way. They can just be as simple as making the job flow better, right? So if you see an opportunity, that may be something you can alter in a way that will make that process work better for you. And it may just be inside your own job, right? So if you have a desk job and you're moving paper around or you're doing things online, there may be an opportunity for you to streamline your own work and take more time off from actually doing work because you did your work faster. And again, it's that idea process, and then you can actually sit down and figure out whether you want to share that idea or not. It's kind of up to you. Now, training, I'm a big fan of training. I love this stuff because I never say no to it. If a company wants to invest in me and give me a new skill, I'm not going to say no. I will absolutely not say no. And now I've got an extra skill. So if the company goes crazy and decides to lay off everybody, well, I've got that new skill that I can take with me. That makes me more marketable. That makes me more transferable. That makes me more interesting as a human being in terms of another company. So that training is actually really honking useful. So if they give it to you, always say yes. Never say no. The other one is your attitude, right? Very little in work is do or die. Very little in work is going to be life altering, right? Very little. You have very little at stake for a regular person in a company. Really, in some ways, you're just that person that does a thing, and that's it. Your boss is going to blow you off. They will absolutely blow you off. Depending on your relationship with the boss and how much your boss respects you, they're probably not going to like your idea. They blow you off. They might use negative language. They may actually say, oh my God, that's so stupid. I've had bosses tell me my ideas are so stupid, right? So take stock of how open your boss is to ideas and just, hey, lessons learned there, man, right? If you can't take ideas to your boss, lesson learned. Fine. There's probably another way to do this, but as we learn, we're going to develop those leadership skills. Right. So if I have a good idea, I may talk about it with my team, right? And I can work in a positive environment or I can work in a negative environment. It's your attitude that's going to help define how you peer lead or community lead. And that's a really big one. Your attitude really helps define leadership and leadership skills. And you're probably going to be doing a leading by example process. You're going to be in there in the trenches with your people. The other thing that's really interesting is that deliberate action, right? And we joke about the butterfly effect. It's an interesting movie. You either loved it or you hated it, but you can change the path of a company. Believe it or not, just a small change can have an outsized effect. So once you understand that sometimes you have good ideas that can have impact, you can start socializing that idea among your work peers. Hey, what do you think of this, Bob? What do you think if we just changed this machine to that machine, or we did this machine and hey, look, I noticed in the manual I can do it this way. What do you think? Right? You don't need a boss for that. You can actually sit down and do all this stuff and be flexible in your peers' feedback and refine your idea to the point where you can take it to a manager, or you can take it to a manager's manager, or you can take it to a suggestion box and say, our team came up with this idea on how to reprogram the machine or how to increase our workflow or how to do this process, business process better. Nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with deliberately thinking through your job and looking at ways of making it better for you and then proposing that idea. Again, that's that whole idea of leading the idea. Sometimes you have to use that shadow organization to your advantage. Now, odds are highly likely you're already doing some of this, right? You're in there with your peers, you're looking at coffee, you're looking at machine process, you're looking at paperwork, you're looking at something else. You are likely commiserating and working within that shadow organization already. You may have peers in other shops or other units or other organizational aspects of the whole process. So you are building your leadership based upon the personal relationships that have a mutual benefit to each other. Now, that is a lot different than a manager's relationship with you, which is generally do what I say, don't talk back, or something else along that way. And your shadow organization is built on personal relationship and mutual benefit, where your managerial relationship is built on do what I say. This does kind of work in conjunction with a formal organization. Sometimes you find other bosses and you hit it off. Maybe you both have kids in t-ball or something else. So that can be helpful, but it happens where that shadow and formal organization kind of overlap. Now, it's interesting, and I think a lot of bosses really forget this because it's really kind of ironically hilarious. The CEO might set the strategic direction and it relies on middle management to carry that out. But employees are the ones who are the relationship across the organization that actually really make things happen, right? So managers are so busy at times infighting with each other, trying to jockey for budget, position, a promotion, or something else. It's really the people that are doing the day-to-day grind that are actually making the organization really work, right? So it's just interesting. You have this dichotomy within the shadow organization that's built on mutual cooperation, and you have a formal organization that sometimes can be built on confrontation and jockeying for power and position. Right. I have not seen a formal organization that didn't have some aspect of that jockeying for power or budget. So this is how you do it, right? Leading when you're not in charge is really built about the personal relationships you have around the organization. And the reason why I'm going to say this is because I got a really funny story on this one, right? So I was leaving an organization. I had voluntarily quit. I was getting ready to go move on and go do something else that was a little bit more my speed. And my boss really did not like me at that point. We had bumped heads more than once, and I was actually really glad to go. But he threw me a party for leaving. And I was, okay, that's kind of cool. It's a way of making up for it. And he put out the notice to the company, hey, Dan's leaving. We're going to have this party at this time on Teams. And about 150 people showed up, which was really cool. That showed the power of the shadow organization that I worked in. Now, my boss did not like me. And one of the comments, and I have this on tape, I actually recorded this meeting because I wanted to have some kind of memory of it. I've got my boss in that meeting saying, I'm surprised you have any friends here. So my boss's opinion of me in the formal organization was actually pretty darn negative. But he was really surprised that in the shadow organization, I had relationships all over this company. Right? And it's because I supported my work group, my peer groups, and peer groups from other places, that I listened to other ideas and was able to help other people do a thing. That I was always in training or doing something else. And I had that attitude that I was bringing to work, which means I was leading and often leading by example. Now, my boss at that point was a big people pleaser and very invested in making sure he looked really, really good for his boss and not so much interested in the three middle managers that he had. And again, to get that idea in his head where he was like, I'm surprised you have friends here, was actually really interesting because he wasn't leading by example and he wasn't authentic in his leadership style. If anything, his leadership style, and among the three people, I was the first to go, the other two left soon after, really kind of showed that he wasn't able to build that camaraderie, right? He was not able to build an all in this together. He was not able to build a peer group. So if you've got that, then you can help manage your manager. It's not just as a person, but as a team. And we did try, right? No offense on this one. And we eventually ended up realizing that we weren't going to change anything to the extent that we really wanted to. So we started making our exit plans soon after we came to this realization as a peer group, us three middle managers. So it's really kind of interesting, right? You can do it, but also don't be surprised if you have some pushback or other things. But man, I tell you what, leading by example, being part of that peer group and working with your teammates is going to go such a long way in leading when you're not in charge.